Miss Marple and a Tragedy on the Milkman's Round. Good evening, dear friends, and welcome to another cosy evening on Gentle Mysteries. I'm Edward, and it's always a pleasure to gather here with you. A warm hello tonight to everyone joining us. Where are you watching from tonight? If you're a fan of relaxing mystery stories like this, make yourself comfortable. The mystery begins. Chapter 1. The village of St. Mary Mead in late January was a place that had made its peace with the cold in the particular way of things that had no choice about it. The horse chestnut on the green had been bare since October, and showed no signs of reconsidering this. The pond at the bottom of the village, which in summer was a pleasant thing with ducks and children and the reflections of the willows, was now a flat grey disk that the frost had attempted twice, and not quite managed to seal over, leaving it instead in a state of sullen half-freezing that was less picturesque than either alternative. The high street was narrow, and the January wind came along it with some purpose, and the people who had errands on it went about them quickly, shoulders up, chins down, the posture of people being briefly outdoors on their way to being indoors again. Miss Jane Marple, who had lived in St. Mary Mead for the whole of her considerable life, and had consequently long since stopped expecting January to be anything other than precisely what it was, stood at her sitting-room window at 6:45 on the morning of Tuesday the 27th and watched the milkman's float come down the lane. She watched it every morning. Not because she was especially interested in the milk, though she was interested in that too, in the practical sense of a woman who managed a household carefully and liked to know when things were as they should be. She watched it because the milkman's round was one of the first human activities of the morning, one of the first opportunities to observe the village in its least composed state, before it had tidied itself and arranged its public face, and Miss Marple had found, over many decades of this observation, that the least composed state of things was generally the most informative. The milkman was a man named Arthur Croft, 43 years old, who had done the round for 11 years, and who drove his float with the practised, unhurried competence of a man who has done a thing so many times it has become a form of thought rather than an action. He was a reliable man. He was on the lane at 6:45 every Tuesday, Thursday and Saturday without fail, the soft whir of the electric float audible from Miss Marple's window 30 seconds before it came into view. This Tuesday morning, the float was 7 minutes late. Miss Marple noticed this the way she noticed everything, without drama, and without yet deciding what it meant, filing it in the category of things that differed from the ordinary, and therefore warranted attention. She watched the float come slowly down the lane and stop at Mrs. Hartnell's gate, and she watched Arthur Croft climb down from the cab, and she noticed that he climbed down differently from the way he usually did, not with the fluid automaticity of a man performing a familiar action, but with the careful deliberateness of someone managing something. He was moving as if he had hurt himself, or as if he'd had a shock. He collected Mrs. Hartnell's 2 pints from the crate and went up the path and set them on the step and came back, and when he turned to climb back up to the cab, Miss Marple could see his face at this distance, the particular pale grey-white of a face that had recently been confronted with something it had not expected. She was already reaching for her coat. She met him at the end of her own path, which gave the encounter the natural quality of a neighbourly coincidence, an elderly lady who happened to be at her gate at the moment the milkman came by. Nothing remarkable about it. "Good morning, Mr. Croft," she said. Arthur Croft looked at her. He was a square-built man, not tall, with the outdoor weathering of someone who started work in all weathers, before the rest of the village was stirring, and this morning his face had, beneath its weathering, the particular quality she had identified from the window. "Morning, Miss Marple," he said. His voice was level enough, but there was something underneath it, controlled rather than absent. "Are you quite well?" she asked, in the conversational way of someone asking after a cold rather than a crisis. He looked at her for a moment, and she had the impression of a man deciding something, the small internal calculation of someone who's been carrying something alone and is reassessing the advisability of continuing to do so. "I don't rightly know," he said. "I found something on the round this morning, up at Jasmine Cottage." Miss Marple was very still in the way that looked like perfect calm. "Jasmine Cottage," she said. "That's Miss Eyre's cottage, isn't it? On the Cornerways Lane." "Yes," Arthur Croft said. He set the 2 pints for Miss Marple's household on her step without looking at them. "She was on the path," he said. "Miss Eyre, on the path between the gate and the door, lying on the path." He stopped. "She was cold," he said. When I checked, Miss Marple picked up her pints and set them just inside her door and came back out. "Come inside, Mr. Croft," she said. "Come in and have a cup of tea and tell me exactly what you found and in what order." He followed her without protest, which told her how badly he had been shaken. Because Arthur Croft was not a man who would ordinarily accept an invitation of this kind on a working morning without considerable persuasion. She put the kettle on and she listened, and outside the January light came slowly up over the frozen garden, pale and flat and entirely without warmth, and St. Mary Mead began its day without yet knowing that something had ended in it before the day had properly started. Chapter 2. What the Milkman Found. Arthur Croft took his tea with both hands around the cup, which was the hold of someone who needed the warmth rather than simply the drink, and Miss Marple sat across from him at the kitchen table and waited while he collected himself, because there was no useful rushing of a man who had found something on a cold path at 6:45 in the morning and had spent the subsequent 20 minutes driving a milk float with it lodged in his chest. "Tell me from the beginning," she said, "from when you turned into Cornaway's Lane." He nodded. He was the kind of man who responded well to a clear instruction, not from any lack of intelligence, but from the natural temperament of someone whose work was ordered and sequential, and who found the same quality reassuring in other contexts. "I came into Cornaway's Lane at about 6:20, he said, "which is when I usually do, give or take. Jasmine Cottage is the second on the left. I pulled up at the gate and got out with her 2 pints. Thursday and Saturday she has 1. Tuesday she has 2 because she does her baking on Wednesday mornings, and she likes to have enough in." Miss Marple noted this detail in the way she noted all details, without emphasis, setting it alongside what she already knew about Miss Eyre, which was that she was a woman of regular habits, and that regular habits, when they were disrupted, told you something. "The gate was open," Arthur Croft said. He said it in the tone of someone who has established this as the first thing wrong, the first departure from the order that should have obtained. "It's never open," he said. "In all the years I've done that path, the gate has always been shut. She's particular about it. She told me once it was because of the foxes. They get into the garden if the gate's not latched." He turned the cup slightly on the table. "So I noticed the gate first, and then I saw her." "Where precisely?" Miss Marple asked. "Halfway up the path," he said. "Between the gate and the front door, maybe 8 feet from the gate, 10 feet from the door. On her side, she was. Her right side. Her arm was out, the right arm, like she'd put it out to catch herself." Miss Marple thought of another woman who had fallen, and another arm, and filed the comparison away for later because it was not yet clear whether it belonged here. Was she on the path itself or on the border? He looked at her, faintly surprised by the precision of the question. "On the path itself," he said. "The left edge of it, near the lavender border. One of the plants was bent where she'd come down on it." "What was she wearing?" "Her housecoat," he said. "The quilted sort, blue, over what looked like her nightdress. And slippers, not outdoor shoes, slippers." So she'd come from inside the cottage and gone down the path in her nightclothes and her slippers, in January, in the dark, or the half-dark of very early morning, which meant she had either been compelled to go out in a hurry or had been taken out without the opportunity to dress. And both of these possibilities had implications. "Her hands," Miss Marple said. "Did you notice her hands?" Arthur Croft looked at her with the expression she had seen before in people she questioned. The slight recalibration of someone who had come expecting comfort, and was receiving something that felt more like an examination. "Her left hand," he said slowly. "She was holding something. I thought at first it was a handkerchief, but it was too stiff for a handkerchief. Could you see what it was?" "Not properly. I didn't—" He stopped. "I didn't like to disturb her more than I had to. I checked for a pulse at her wrist, and there wasn't one, and then I didn't touch anything else because it didn't seem right." He looked at the table. "I should have gone for the doctor straight away. I sat in the float for a bit first. I'm not proud of that." "You were shocked," Miss Marple said, with the matter-of-fact kindness of someone who does not consider shock a failing. "Anyone would have been. And you did go for the doctor?" "I went to doctor. Haydock's house directly after. He was already up. He went straight there." He paused. "He told me to continue the round and say nothing for now. Said he'd send word." "Yes," said Miss Marple. "That would be right." She poured him more tea without asking whether he wanted it. "Mr. Croft, think carefully. When you came into Cornaway's Lane at 6:20, was there anyone else about? On the lane, or on the path, or coming away from the direction of the cottage?" he thought. She watched him think, which was a visible process in him. a slowing and a focusing, the face of a man who did not speak until he had something to say. "A motor car," he said at last. "I didn't see it. I heard it. When I was pulling up at the gate, an engine somewhere further along the lane past the cottage going away from me. Toward the Melchester Road end. Could you tell what kind? Not at that distance and in the dark, no. Just an engine. It was moving, not starting, so it had been there a while or had just arrived and was already leaving." He paused. "It was a cold engine." Miss Marple looked at him. "What do you mean?" "The sound of a cold engine is different from a warm one," he said, with the mild confidence of a man who worked with motors every morning and knew the distinction as instinctively as a musician knew pitch. "A warm engine that's been running a while sounds different when it pulls away. This one was cold. It had been sitting for a bit, not running, or it had only just started." Miss Marple set down her own cup. A cold engine on Cornaway's Lane at 6:20 in the morning in January. Or us, going away from a cottage where a woman lay on her path in her nightclothes and her slippers. "Thank you, Mr. Croft," she said. "You have been very helpful indeed, and I don't think you quite know how helpful." He looked at her with the expression she had learned to recognise, the expression of someone who has been in Miss Marple's kitchen for 20 minutes, and is only now beginning to understand what kind of conversation they have been having. "Miss Marple," he said carefully, "do you think it wasn't natural?" She looked at him with her mild blue eyes. "I think," she said, "that a woman who is particular about her gait does not go down her path in her slippers in January, and leave it open behind her without a reason, and I think the reason is worth finding out." She stood and picked up her coat from the hook by the kitchen door. "Finish your tea, and if anyone asks you what time you found her at 6:20, and you went directly to Dr. Haydock, and you said nothing to anyone else. Can you do that?" "Yes," said Arthur Croft, and he sounded steadier now, which was what the tea and the conversation and the clear instruction had been intended to produce. Miss Marple put on her coat and her hat and her stoutest shoes, and went out into the January morning to walk to Cornaway's Lane. She knew Winifred Eyre the way she knew everyone in St. Mary Mead, thoroughly and over time. Winifred was 61, a retired schoolmistress who had taught at the village school for 22 years, before her retirement 4 years ago, unmarried, precise in her habits. Moderately sociable in the manner of a woman who enjoyed company in controlled quantities, and had arranged her life to provide it on those terms. She had a small circle of genuine friends and a wider circle of village acquaintance. She grew dahlias in summer with considerable success, and she had an arrangement with Mrs. Liddell at the post office to collect her newspaper each morning on her constitutional, rather than have it delivered, because she had told Miss Marple once she liked the walk and she liked the reason for it. Her constitutional took her along Cornaway's Lane, down to the post office on the High Street, and back by the lower path, and she did this at 7:30 every morning without exception. At 6:20 she should have been inside, asleep or just rising, not on her path in her nightclothes. Miss Marple turned into Cornaway's Lane and walked toward the second cottage on the left, and she thought about a woman who liked the walk and the reason for it, and about what reason could possibly have brought her outside before there was yet any light to walk in. Dr. Haydock met her at the gate, which was now closed, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who was not surprised to see her, and had mixed feelings about this. "Jane," he said. "James," she said, "what have you found?" He glanced along the lane in both directions, which was empty, and then back at her, and he said, "Come in, but don't go near the path. The police will want to see it as it is." "You've called the police," she said. "I've called Inspector Slack," he said, "because I am obliged to, and because whatever Inspector Slack's limitations, the correct procedure here is for him to be involved whether he is useful or not." "What has he said?" "He hasn't arrived yet. He said 20 minutes when I rang, and that was 15 minutes ago." He held the gate for her and then latched it firmly behind them. "From the gate you can see her. Don't go further than the gate." Miss Marple stood at the gate and looked up the path. Winifred Eyre lay as Arthur Croft had described her, on her right side, her right arm extended, her blue quilted housecoat the brightest thing visible in the grey January morning. She was on the left edge of the path, just where the path met the lavender border, and one of the lavender plants was bent flat where she had come down on it. Her left hand, the one closest to Miss Marple's view from the gate, was closed around something small and pale. Miss Marple looked at the left hand for a long moment, then she looked at the path. The path was stone, old York stone, uneven at the edges, and the frost had been on it since some time in the night. The frost was undisturbed on the right side of the path, and on the left side, between where Winifred lay and the lavender border, there was a partial disturbance, the kind made by feet. 2 sets of feet, not 1. She looked at Dr. Haydock. 2 people came down this path, she said. Yes, he said quietly, that is what I thought as well. Behind them on the lane, a motor car turned in at the Melchester Road end, and Miss Marple recognised from the sound of its engine, which was warm and certain and somewhat aggressive in its approach, the vehicle of Inspector Slack. She turned from the gate and composed her face into the expression she used for Inspector Slack, which was the expression of a mildly interested elderly lady who happened to be passing and did not intend to be any trouble whatsoever. She had a considerable amount to do before Inspector Slack made up his mind about anything, and it was important that he not know this. Chapter 3. The Thing in the Left Hand. Inspector Slack arrived with the particular energy of a man who considered speed of arrival to be itself a form of competence, and he greeted Miss Marple's presence at the gate of Jasmine Cottage with the expression he reserved for her specifically, which was a combination of professional tolerance and the slightly hunted look of someone who's been caught out before and is hoping not to be caught out again. "Miss Marple," he said, in the tone of a statement rather than a greeting. "Inspector Slack," she said pleasantly. "What a cold morning. I do hope you have had breakfast." He had not, she could tell, which went some way toward explaining the energy, and she filed this away as useful. A hungry Inspector Slack was a faster Inspector Slack, more likely to arrive at a conclusion and commit to it without the extended deliberation that sometimes improved his conclusions and sometimes did not. He went through the gate, after a brief and largely unrevealing conversation with Dr. Haydock, and Miss Marple remained where she was and observed what she could observe from the gate, which was sufficient. She was looking at the path again. The frost disturbance she had identified told her 2 people had come down from the front door toward the gate, but it did not tell her in what order or under what circumstances. It told her that both sets of feet had been on the left side of the path, close to the lavender border, which was the side nearest to where Winifred had fallen, and it told her that one set of prints was the slippered impressions of Winifred herself, small and flat-soled, and the other set was larger, the deeper impression of an outdoor shoe or boot, a sole with some tread to it, the kind worn by a person who had come from outside rather than from a warm house. 2 people on the path, one who belonged there, one who did not. She looked at Winifred's left hand, closed around the small pale thing. From the gate in the flat January light she could not make it out with certainty. It was approximately the size and shape of a visiting card, or a folded piece of paper, or a small envelope. It was pale, cream or white, and Winifred's grip on it, even now, was the firm grip of someone who had closed their hand deliberately, rather than fallen with it already there. She had picked it up, or she had been given it, or she had been trying to keep it from someone. Miss Marple thought about a woman who liked the walk and the reason for it, and about what reason could have brought her down a frost-covered path in slippers and a housecoat in the dark of a January morning, and she thought that the most probable reason was another person, a person she had admitted from the gate or met on the path, a person who had given her either a reason to come outside or no choice in the matter, a person with outdoor shoes who had arrived in a cold-engine motor car that was now somewhere on the Melchester Road. She did not wait for Inspector Slack to finish his examination. She went instead to speak with the neighbours. Cornaway's Lane had 7 cottages on it, Jasmine Cottage being the second on the left going in from the High Street end, and Miss Marple worked her way along the lane in the manner of a woman paying morning calls, which was not entirely false because she was, in a sense, doing exactly that. The first cottage was occupied by a retired couple named Fowler, Edward and Marjorie, who were in their late 70s and who slept, they told her, with rather more thoroughness than they once had, and who had heard nothing in the night beyond Edward Fowler's complaints about the cold, which were not, they both agreed, especially informative about external events. The third cottage, on the right side of the lane past Jasmine Cottage, belonged to a woman named Mrs. Iris Dodd, who was 47, and who worked 3 days a week at the Melchester Library, and spent the remaining 4 in a state of domestic activity that she described as keeping on top of things, which had the flavour of a battle in which the outcome was never entirely settled. Mrs. Dodd answered the door in her housecoat, which was not quilted and not blue, but was otherwise similar in spirit to the one that Winifred Eyre was wearing on the path, and she had the look of someone who had heard something. I heard the motor car, she said, before Miss Marple had asked about it. Last night? Or this morning, I suppose, depending on how you count it. It was still dark. I heard an engine in the lane quite close, and I looked at the clock and it was 6:10. 10 minutes before Arthur Croft turned into the lane. 10 minutes in which a cold-engine motor car sat in Cornaway's Lane with its engine not running, which was what you did when you did not wish to be heard. Did you look out? Miss Marple asked. I did, yes. Through the bedroom curtain. I couldn't see much. The lane was dark. There's only the one lamp and it doesn't reach this far. I could see the shape of a car parked against the hedge opposite. She paused. Opposite Miss Eyre's. One person or two in the car, Mrs. Dodd thought carefully. I couldn't say. I only saw the car itself, not inside it. It was dark. Did you see anyone on the lane, on foot? No, but I only looked for a moment. I thought it was someone who had broken down, or taken a wrong turning. It happens sometimes at night when people are lost. She pulled her housecoat more firmly around her. I went back to bed. I heard the engine start up again at about 20 past, going toward the Melchester Road. And then I heard the milk float a minute or two later, and I thought nothing more of it until I saw the police car. The engine starting at 20 past, Miss Marple said, the same time Mr. Croft arrived. About then, yes. So the car had been on the lane from 6:10 until 6:20. 10 minutes. A person who had arrived before the milkman, done what they came to do, and left when the float turned into the lane, because the float's arrival was something they did not want to be present for, someone who knew the milkman's schedule. Miss Marple left Mrs. Dodd's cottage and stood in the lane for a moment considering. The knowledge of Arthur Croft's schedule was not exclusive. He had done the round for 11 years. Anyone who received milk from him, or who knew anyone who did, knew roughly when he would be at any given point on his route. Cornaway's Lane at 6:20 was common knowledge to anyone who had ever stood at a gate on a winter morning and heard the float coming. She went to the remaining cottages on the lane and found, at the fourth one, another piece of information. The fourth cottage was occupied by a young woman named Patricia Vane, who was 29 and who rented the cottage and worked as a secretary at the Agricultural College outside Melchester, and who was in the process of eating toast at her kitchen table when Miss Marple knocked, and who let her in with the slightly dazed goodwill of someone who has been awake for less than an hour. Patricia Vane had not heard the motor car. What she had heard was a door. Miss Eyre's front door, she said, with the confidence of someone who had specific knowledge of a specific sound. Sometime after 6, I was awake. I'd set my alarm early because I had letters to type before the first lecture. I heard the door quite clearly. It's a heavy door. You can hear it close from here when the lane is quiet. She frowned. Actually, I heard it twice. Twice, Miss Marple said. Once closing, which I barely noticed, and then a few minutes later, again, like it had been opened and closed a second time. She looked at Miss Marple with a slightly uncertain expression of someone who is offering information they are not sure is useful. Is that important? Has something happened to Miss Eyre? I'm afraid Miss Eyre has been taken ill, Miss Marple said, which was true as far as it went. I'm just trying to establish the sequence of events so that Dr. Haydock has a clear picture. She said this in the comfortable manner of someone conveying routine information, and Patricia Vane received it in kind, and the conversation concluded with Miss Marple back on the lane, and in possession of something that had not been there before. 2 door closings, a door opened once and then again, some minutes apart, which meant, Miss Marple thought, walking back toward Jasmine Cottage, that someone had left the cottage and then the door had opened or closed again. Either Winifred had gone out and come back in, or Winifred had gone out and someone else had come in after her, or someone had been inside the cottage and Winifred had gone out, and then the person inside had also left. 3 possibilities. The path told her 2 people had been on it. The left hand told her Winifred had been holding something. She needed to know what was in the left hand. Dr. Haydock found her at the gate when he came back down the path, and he looked at her with the expression that meant he had something to tell her, and was deciding how to tell it. The thing in her hand, Miss Marple said. He looked at her. A receipt, he said. A shop receipt from Enderby's Hardware in Melchester, dated yesterday, Monday the 26th. For a quantity of rat poison. Miss Marple was perfectly still. The receipt was not hers, Haydock said. The name on it was a trade account. The account name was Crane. He paused. There is only one Crane in the village, Jane. Yes, Miss Marple said. There is. Martin Crane ran the market garden on the Pelbury Road, half a mile north of the village. He was 41, a widower of 2 years, and he had been, as the village well knew because the village knew everything in the end, walking out with Winifred Eyre since the previous spring. Miss Marple looked at the gate latch, and at the frost on the path, and at the lavender border with its bent plant, and she thought about a woman who had been walking out with a market gardener since spring, and who had, sometime in the small hours of a January morning, come down her garden path in her slippers, holding a receipt for rat poison purchased on his trade account. She thought about what that meant. She thought about what it did not necessarily mean, and she thought about Martin Crane, who was a widower of 2 years, and about what his wife had died of, and about the particular quality of a coincidence that was not comfortable to look at directly. Chapter 4. The Market Gardener's Widow. Mrs. Crane had died in February of the previous year. Miss Marple had attended the funeral, as she attended most funerals in St. Mary Mead, not from morbidity but from the same instinct that brought her to the church gate on Sunday mornings, which was that funerals, like all significant gatherings of village people, told you things about the relationships between them that ordinary life kept covered. She had stood in the cold churchyard on that February morning and watched Martin Crane at the graveside and noted, in her usual way, the quality of his grief, which was the genuine grief of a man who had lost something, genuine but not uncomplicated, and she had thought at the time that the lack of complication in grief was generally a function of the lack of complication in the life that preceded it, which was to say that simple grief meant a simple marriage, and complicated grief meant the other sort. Martin Crane's grief had been complicated. She had not pressed on this at the time because it was not her business at the time, and she had noted it and moved on, and it had sat in the category of things observed and not yet connected to anything, which was a large category in Miss Marple's mind and a useful one. Helen Crane had been 43 when she died. She had been ill for 3 months with what Dr. Haydock had diagnosed, on the basis of her symptoms and the general picture, as a severe gastric illness of the kind that was not uncommon in people who spent a great deal of time outdoors in all weathers and who were sometimes inclined to be careless about washing their hands after working with soil. She had declined steadily through December and January and died in February, and it had been, Dr. Haydock said, a very unpleasant few months for everyone involved, which was the measured language of a doctor describing something difficult. He had not, at the time, ordered a post-mortem. There had been no reason to. Miss Marple was walking to the market garden on the Pelbury Road at 9 o'clock on Tuesday morning, through the flat grey January cold, and she was thinking about this now with the concentration it deserved. A severe gastric illness, 3 months of decline, in a woman who was otherwise healthy and 43 years old. And now, 18 months later, the woman who had been walking out with the widower since spring had been found dead on her garden path in her nightclothes, holding a receipt for rat poison on his trade account. Miss Marple was a woman who had spent a long life resisting the conclusions that arrived too easily, because she had found that easy conclusions were frequently the ones that had been arranged for you to arrive at, either by circumstance or by someone cleverer than the circumstance. She had found Martin Crane's grief complicated, but complicated grief was not evidence of anything except a complicated marriage, and complicated marriages were not rare. The receipt could have been in Winifred's possession for any number of reasons. Winifred had a garden. Gardens sometimes had rats. A woman who kept dahlias might have reason to purchase rat poison, and she might have asked her companion to buy it for her on his trade account as a simple convenience. These were all possible. They were also, she thought, the explanations that a person would offer who needed an explanation. She needed to know much more before she decided what she thought. The market garden on the Pelbury Road was a working concern of modest but real productivity, perhaps 4 acres of managed growing land behind a long, low farmhouse that had been in the Crane family for 3 generations. In January it presented its least attractive face to the world, the beds bare and turned, the glass of the greenhouses fogged with condensation, the yard in front of the farmhouse a mixture of mud and straw that the frost had stiffened but not improved. A dog barked from somewhere inside a barn and was not answered. Martin Crane came out of the farmhouse when he heard the gate, and he was already in his working clothes, which told Miss Marple he had either not heard about Winifred Eyre, or had heard and was managing it by working, which was something people sometimes did. He was a compact, dark-haired man who looked younger than 41, and moved with the physical economy of someone who did outdoor physical work and had developed the habit of not wasting effort. He had a good face, open-featured and brown from the weather, and when he saw Miss Marple he stopped, and his expression changed in the way that expressions changed when people understood that an elderly lady walking to their farm on a January morning was not simply taking the air. "Miss Marple," he said. "Good morning, Mr. Crane," she said. "I am sorry to come without warning. I wonder if I might have a word." He looked at her for a moment in the calculating way of someone who is trying to determine how much a person knows before deciding how to respond to them, and then he stood back from the gate and said, "You'd best come in." The farmhouse kitchen was warm in the straightforward way of a room that had an Aga, and Miss Marple sat at the kitchen table, which was scrubbed pine, old and well-maintained, and accepted the cup of tea that Martin Crane made without asking whether she wanted one, which told her he had been brought up correctly and that he was buying himself time. He sat down across from her with his own cup and looked at his hands for a moment, and then at her, and he said, "You've heard about Winifred?" "Yes," she said. "I was there this morning at the cottage. I spoke with Doctor." Hey, Doc." He absorbed this. "They're saying it was her heart," he said. "When she rang me last night, she was perfectly well." Miss Marple was still. "She rang you last night," she said. "What time?" "About 9, he said. "She rang to say she wouldn't be able to come to supper on Wednesday. She said she thought she was getting a chill and she didn't want to go out." He looked at the table. She sounded perfectly well. She was apologetic about the supper. A woman who rang her companion at 9 in the evening sounding perfectly well and apologetic about a supper arrangement was not a woman who had decided to go walking down her garden path in her slippers at 6:10 the following morning. She was a woman who had expected to be inside, warm, recovering from a chill she thought she was developing. Something had changed between 9 in the evening and 6:10 in the morning. "The receipt," Miss Marple said, gently but directly, because she had learned that directness, properly employed, was sometimes kinder than circumlocution. "The receipt for rat poison from Enderby's hardware. On your trade account. Dr. Haydock found it in Winifred's hand." Martin Crane looked up at her. "In her hand," he said. Not a question. A repetition with a particular quality of someone hearing something that changes the shape of what they thought they knew. "Yes," Miss Marple said. He set down his cup. "I bought rat poison on Monday," he said, "for the grain store. We've had a problem since autumn. I've been putting it off because of the dog, but they're getting into the winter stores and it needed dealing with." "Did you give the receipt to Winifred?" "No," he said, flatly and immediately. "No, I put it in my coat pocket. I always keep receipts for the accounts." He stopped. "My coat," he said. "Yes?" Miss Marple said. He stood up and went to the hook by the back door where several coats hung, and patted the pockets of the topmost one, a heavy wax jacket, methodically, and then went through them, and then looked at Miss Marple with an expression that had, beneath its surface composure, something that was beginning to look very like fear. "It's not there," he said. "When did you last wear that coat?" "Yesterday," he said. "Monday. I wore it to Melchester in the morning, to Enderby's among other places, and then I had it on here all afternoon." "Oh, and yesterday evening," he paused. "Winifred came by yesterday evening." Miss Marple looked at him. "She came by at about 6, he said, to return a book she'd borrowed. She only stayed 20 minutes, half an hour at most. She had the coat on the hook while she was here. She takes hers off and hangs it on the same hook when she comes in. It's what she always does. They'd have been hanging together." He stopped. "She didn't take it," he said. "Winifred wouldn't take anything that wasn't hers." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "She wouldn't." She was thinking about a receipt taken from a coat pocket, and about who else might have been in this kitchen, and when, and what they would have needed such a receipt for. She was also thinking about a woman who had been found holding something she had not had when she went to bed. Between 9 in the evening, when Winifred was well and apologetic about supper, and 6:10 in the morning, when she was on the path in her slippers, someone had brought that receipt to Jasmine Cottage, and she was beginning to understand why. "Mr. Crane," she said carefully, "has anyone else been in this kitchen in the past day or two? Someone who would have known where your coat hangs and what your trade accounts cover?" Martin Crane sat down slowly. He looked at his tea, which had gone cold, and then at the window through which the grey January market garden was visible, bare and still. "My sister," he said, after a moment. "Dorothy. She came yesterday afternoon while I was in the top field. She has a key. She lets herself in sometimes to leave things, bread or a pie. She still thinks I don't eat properly since Helen died." He paused. "She was here an hour. Mrs. Poole, next door, saw her car." Miss Marple set down her own cup with a small, precise sound. "Tell me about Dorothy," she said. Chapter 5. The Sister with the Key. Dorothy Crane was not Dorothy Crane any longer. She had been Dorothy Crane until 1938, when she married a man named Geoffrey Pratt, and became Dorothy Pratt, and she had been Dorothy Pratt until 1947, when Geoffrey Pratt died of a coronary and left her his house, his motor car, a modest but sufficient income from 2 tied cottages he owned in the next village, and a temperament that had, by all observable evidence, not been improved by 14 years of marriage to a man who had not been easy to be married to. She was 44, 3 years younger than her brother, and she lived in a stone house on the far side of the village from the market garden, which was far enough for the distance to feel intentional, without being far enough to mean anything when the question of access arose. She drove a dark green Morris Minor, which was the car Mrs. Poole had seen parked outside the market garden on Monday afternoon. Miss Marple knew Dorothy Pratt in the way she knew most people in and around St. Mary Mead, which was at a sufficient depth to have formed a view, and at a sufficient distance to have formed it fairly. Dorothy was a capable woman, intelligent in the practical sense, not warm but not unkind, the kind of woman who organised things, who knew where things were kept and whose job it was to do what, who sat on committees with competence and chaired them when asked with the crisp efficiency of someone to whom disorder was a personal affront. She had been devoted to Helen Crane. This was the thing Miss Marple was thinking about as she walked back from the market garden toward the village. Past the bare hedgerows and the frozen field margins, the collar of her coat turned up against the wind off the open ground. Dorothy Pratt had been devoted to Helen Crane, which was the sort of thing one heard said of the wife's friend or the husband's sister, a relationship that carried within it a particular weight of loyalty that was not always straightforwardly about the person it appeared to be about. Miss Marple had known a situation rather like it 30 years ago, a woman who had been devoted to her brother's wife in a way that was also, underneath, a form of possession, an arrangement of affection that had at its centre not so much love as the question of who belonged to whom. She had been devoted to Helen Crane, and Helen Crane had died of a severe gastric illness that had lasted 3 months. And 18 months after Helen's death, Martin Crane had begun walking out with Winifred Eyre. Miss Marple thought about the timeline of this with the same careful attention she brought to a pattern that wasn't adding up. Dorothy had, presumably, accepted Helen's death as what it appeared to be. She had no reason not to. But the arrival of Winifred Eyre in her brother's life, the growing seriousness of that arrangement, the prospect of Martin remarrying, perhaps bringing another woman into the farmhouse kitchen where Helen's things had stood for years, perhaps changing things that Dorothy considered settled, this was a different matter. The receipt for rat poison was the thing she kept coming back to. Not because it proved anything on its own, because it did not. A receipt was only a receipt. Rat poison was a legitimate purchase for a market garden with a grain store problem, and Dorothy Pratt had perfectly ordinary reasons to be in her brother's kitchen. But Winifred had been holding it. Winifred had gone out in her slippers at 6:10 in the morning and down her frost-covered path, and had been found there holding a receipt for rat poison, purchased on Martin Crane's trade account. She had not been sleepwalking. She had not fallen in a simple faint. There were 2 sets of footprints on the path and a motor car parked against the hedge with its engine cold, and a front door that had opened and closed twice in the hour before Arthur Croft arrived with the milk. Someone had come to Jasmine Cottage in the dark of a January morning, and Winifred had gone down the path to meet them and had not come back inside. And what Winifred had been holding was something she had either been given on the path or had seized from the person she went to meet, which meant that either the receipt had been brought to her, or she had taken it from the person who had it. Miss Marple stopped walking at the corner of the lane that led to Dorothy Pratt's stone house, and stood for a moment in the cold, thinking about which of these was more probable, and about what Winifred Eyre would have done if she'd discovered something that frightened her, and about the telephone call at 9 in the evening in which Winifred had sounded well and apologetic and nothing more. A woman who had found something alarming and decided to confront it would not ring her companion at 9 and sound perfectly ordinary. She would ring him and tell him what she had found, or she would ring Doctor, Haydock, or she would ring someone, unless she had not yet found it at 9, unless the finding came after. Miss Marple turned down the lane toward Dorothy Pratt's house, walking at her usual deliberate pace, and she thought about what could have happened between 9 in the evening and 6:10 in the morning to bring 2 people out onto a frost-covered path in the dark. One possibility was that someone had come to Winifred after 9, bringing the receipt, using it as a threat or a warning. Look what your Martin has done, or look what your Martin is. The receipt as an insinuation, a seed of doubt planted in the dark. But an insinuation brought at 6 in the morning did not usually result in a death, unless the insinuation was delivered by someone with a further purpose than mere insinuation. Another possibility was that Winifred had found the receipt herself somehow, between 9 and 6, that it had been left for her, or sent to her, or put somewhere she would find it, and that having found it she had gone to confront someone. Not Martin, because she would have telephoned Martin. Someone else. Someone whose green Morris Minor was parked on Cornaway's Lane with its engine cold. Dorothy Pratt answered the door in a skirt and a good wool jumper, the clothes of a woman who dressed properly even at home, and she looked at Miss Marple with the bright, slightly wary expression of someone who is composing themselves at speed. "Miss Marple," she said, "what brings you out in this weather?" "I am sure you have heard about Winifred Eyre," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I've been calling on people in the lane and so forth. You know how one does when something sad happens in a small place. I thought I would call on you as well, since you knew her through Martin." This was not untrue, and it was not entirely what it appeared to be, and Dorothy Pratt was intelligent enough to register both things, though Miss Marple thought she registered the first rather more than the second. "Of course," Dorothy said. "Do come in. It's a dreadful business. Martin must be devastated." She said this with the fluency of the correct sentiment, and Miss Marple stepped inside and noted 3 things in rapid succession. The first was the dark green Morris Minor visible through the kitchen window, parked in the side passage of the house. It had, on its front bumper, a quantity of mud consistent with having been on a lane or track, rather than a road in recent hours. The second was a pair of outdoor shoes on the mat inside the front door, stout lace-ups with a thick rubber sole and a distinct tread pattern, and on the left shoe, caught in the tread, a fragment of lavender, the dry silver grey of winter lavender, snapped off cleanly as if stepped upon. The third was Dorothy Pratt's hands, which were steady and capable, and were engaged in smoothing her skirt in the manner of a woman who wanted something to do with them. "How dreadful it must have been," Miss Marple said, following her into the sitting-room, "for anyone who happened to be in the lane this morning. Mrs. Dodd at the 3rd cottage said she heard a motor car very early, before 6, I believe." Dorothy Pratt sat down and crossed her ankles and said, "Did she? People are always cutting through the lane to avoid the high street. It's a short-cut if you know it." "Yes," said Miss Marple, "though at 6:10 in the morning in January one does wonder where anyone would be cutting through to." She said this in the mild, vaguely wondering tone of someone thinking aloud, and she watched Dorothy Pratt receive it, and she watched the slight adjustment, the smallest recalibration of position, the quality of attention that a person brought to bear when they understood that the ground had shifted slightly under them. "Martin's terribly fond of her," Dorothy said, redirecting with the competence of someone changing a subject they have decided to change. "Winifred, he'll be very cut up." "Yes," said Miss Marple. They had become quite close, hadn't they? "I imagine there were people who found that a comfort, and people who found it rather more complicated." She looked at Dorothy Pratt with her mild blue eyes, and Dorothy looked back at her, and there was a moment in which both women understood perfectly well what was being said and what was not being said, and the sitting-room was very quiet around them. Then Dorothy Pratt looked at the window, and the look that crossed her face was not the look of a guilty person caught, but the look, which was considerably more complicated, of a person who had done something they had believed was necessary, and were now confronting the possibility that it had not been. "She wasn't right for him," she said. It came out smaller than she had intended, Miss Marple thought, less certain. "No," Miss Marple said quietly, "I expect you felt that. And I expect you felt it very strongly." She paused. "Dorothy, I need you to tell me what happened this morning. Not what you think I know, and not what you think will be believed. What actually happened." Dorothy Pratt looked at her hands, now folded in her lap, still steady but no longer engaged in anything. Outside, the January wind moved along the lane, the bare hedges rustling with it, and a thin, cold light lay across the sitting-room floor between them, and Miss Marple waited, because she had learned that when the right question had been asked, the right silence was all that remained to ask. Chapter 6. What Dorothy Said. Dorothy Pratt did not speak immediately. She sat in her chair with her hands folded and looked at the space between herself and the window, the thin January light lying across the floor between them. And Miss Marple did not fill the silence, because she had learned that this particular kind of silence, the silence of a person who has been asked the right question and is deciding whether to answer it honestly, was the most productive silence there was, provided one had the patience to let it continue. Dorothy had the look of a woman who had been holding herself at a certain tension for a considerable number of hours and was beginning to understand that the effort of maintaining it was greater than the effort of letting it go. She said at last, "I didn't intend for it to happen." Miss Marple said nothing, which was an invitation to continue rather than a response. "I went to her cottage to talk to her," Dorothy said. "That was all I intended, to talk to her." She unfolded her hands and refolded them, a small restless movement that was the only outward sign of what was underneath. "I had the receipt in my pocket. I had taken it from Martin's coat on Monday afternoon when I was at the farm. Yes, I did take it, because I thought I could use it. I thought if she understood what kind of man he was, what he was capable of, she would stop. She would see what I saw, and she would stop." "What did you think the receipt showed?" Miss Marple asked. Dorothy looked at her with an expression that had something bleak in it. "I thought it would be enough to make her doubt him. I didn't think she would know what it meant. I thought she would find the idea of it frightening, the rat poison on the account. And I would tell her things had been put on that account before, that Helen had been ill, that there were questions." She stopped. "I knew there weren't really questions. I knew Helen died of her illness, but I thought if I planted the idea, if I made Winifred uncertain, she would pull away from him. She was the cautious sort. I thought she'd pull away." Miss Marple looked at her steadily. "You went to the cottage at 6:10 in the morning." "I couldn't sleep," Dorothy said. "I'd had the receipt since Monday afternoon, and I'd been going back and forth about it all day and all evening, and I couldn't sleep. And I thought if I went early, before anyone was about, before Martin could telephone her or come by, I could say what I needed to say and go." She paused. "I knocked at the door. She came to the door. She was already awake. She had the light on in the hall. She let me in." "She let you in," Miss Marple said. "We were not friends, but we were not unfriendly," Dorothy said with a slight stiffness. "She would not have refused to let me in. She was too well-mannered for that." A pause. "We sat in her kitchen. I showed her the receipt. I said what I'd planned to say, about Helen, about there being questions, about the rat poison." She stopped again, and this time the stop was longer. "She didn't react the way I expected." "How did she react?" Miss Marple asked. Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "She was calm," she said. "She was completely calm. She looked at the receipt, and she looked at me, and she said she knew Martin had bought rat poison this week because he had mentioned the grain store problem to her, and she had suggested he deal with it before it got worse. She said she had recommended the specific product because she had used it in her own garden 2 autumns ago." She paused. "She said she was sorry for my loss, that losing a sister-in-law one was fond of must be very painful, and that she understood why I might be finding Martin's attachment to her difficult." Miss Marple looked at her. She turned it back to you. "She was kind about it," Dorothy said, and the word kind came out with a complicated texture, not quite bitterness, and not quite admiration, but something partway between. "She was genuinely kind. She said she had no intention of replacing Helen in any sense that would diminish Helen, that she respected what Helen had meant to Martin and to me, and that if I needed more time before I could be comfortable with the situation, she quite understood, and she hoped I would be patient with myself." Dorothy's hands moved again. She said this as if she were talking to one of her school classes, clear and kind and not unkind about it. "And then?" Miss Marple said. "And then she stood up to show me out," Dorothy said. "And I stood up and I had the receipt still in my hand, and she put her hand out for it, very naturally, as if she were tidying something away, and I gave it to her, and she put it in her housecoat pocket." Miss Marple was very still. "She put it in her pocket?" "Yes." Dorothy looked at her. "And we went to the front door, and she opened it, and I went out first, down the path, and she came out after me, I assumed to latch the gate behind me. She was particular about the gate." She stopped. "She was behind me, and then she made a sound. Not a word, just a sound, a sharp intake of breath, and I turned around and she was on the path." "Where were you when she fell?" 3 or 4 feet ahead of her, near the gate. I turned and she was on the left side of the path, the lavender side on her side, and I went back to her and she was—" Dorothy paused and something in her face shifted, a tightening that was not quite pain but was adjacent to it. She was still. Her eyes were open, but she was still. "You didn't call for help," Miss Marple said. A long pause, long enough that Miss Marple could hear the clock on Dorothy's mantelpiece. A small sound in the quiet room. "No," Dorothy said. "I did not call for help." "You left." "I left," Dorothy said. She said it with the flatness of a person stating a fact they have stopped trying to soften. I went back to the car and I drove away, and I told myself it was her heart, that it had been her heart and nothing to do with me, that she'd simply fallen, and that if I called anyone I would have to explain what I had been doing there. Miss Marple looked at her with an expression that was not judgment, because the time for judgment was not now, and was not hers in any case. "Dorothy," she said carefully, "whatever she died of, whether it was her heart or something else, Dr. Haydock will determine that. You cannot determine it, and I cannot. But a woman fell on her path in front of you and you left without seeking help. And that is a thing that will need to be accounted for, and it will be considerably better for you if you account for it yourself today to Inspector Slack, rather than waiting for Inspector Slack to account for it on your behalf." Dorothy looked at her. "Did she die because of me?" "I don't know," Miss Marple said honestly. "I don't know whether she might have been saved if help had come sooner. Dr. Haydock doesn't know yet either. That is precisely why the question must be answered properly by people equipped to answer it." Dorothy Pratt sat in her chair and looked at the floor for a moment, and then she looked up at Miss Marple with the expression of a woman who has come to the end of a road she did not intend to be on, and is deciding what to do now that she's at the end of it. "Will you come with me?" she said. "To speak with Inspector Slack. Will you come?" It was not quite a question. It was the request of someone who needed a witness of a particular kind, someone who would be present without participating, who would see that things were said correctly and received fairly. "Yes," Miss Marple said, "I will come." She telephoned Dr. Haydock from Dorothy's hallway, briefly and quietly, while Dorothy went upstairs to put on her outdoor coat, and she told him two things. The first was that she was bringing Dorothy Pratt to speak with Inspector Slack within the hour. The second was a question. "James," she said, "the post-mortem. Can you tell yet how she died?" Haydock was quiet for a moment on the line. "Preliminary indications suggest a cardiac event," he said. "She had an undiagnosed condition, a valve defect, the kind that produces no symptoms in mild conditions and becomes dangerous in cold and stress. Going out in January, temperatures in nightclothes, with some degree of agitation would have been—" He paused. "It would have been very hard on it." "So she died of her heart," Miss Marple said. "Her heart failed," Haydock said carefully. "Whether it failed because of the cold alone or because of the cold and the circumstances combined is a question of degree rather than of cause. She would not have died that morning if she had stayed inside." He paused again. "Whether she would have survived if help had come more quickly is a question I cannot answer with certainty. But it is possible. It is possible," he said. Miss Marple stood in Dorothy Pratt's hallway and looked at the outdoor shoes on the mat with the fragment of winter lavender caught in the tread. And she thought about a woman who had been calm and kind and clear, who had taken the receipt from Dorothy's hand as if tidying something away, who had put it in her pocket and come out to latch the gate, and then had simply fallen. Her heart undone by the cold and the stress of an early morning visit she had managed with more composure than it deserved. The receipt had not killed her. Dorothy Pratt had not killed her. But Dorothy Pratt had been the last event in a chain of events that a woman with a defective heart valve had not been able to survive, and that was a thing that would require careful examination by people whose job it was to examine such things. And there was no tidy resolution to it, no clean line between innocent and guilty, no version of the morning that left everyone in their proper category. This was, Miss Marple thought, the kind of case that did not conclude so much as stop. The kind where the answer to what happened was clear and the answer to what it meant was not. Upstairs she heard Dorothy Pratt moving about, getting ready to do the right thing too late, which was the tragedy of it. Chapter 7. The Question of Helen Crane. Inspector Slack received Dorothy Pratt's account with the concentrated attention of a man who had been preparing himself for a vagrant theory, and had found himself with something considerably more substantial, and he received it in a way that, while not exactly gracious, was professional enough, that Miss Marple felt able to leave Dorothy in his care after the first hour, and walk back through the village toward the one remaining question she had not yet answered. The question of Helen Crane. She had not forgotten it. She had set it to one side in the way she sometimes set things to one side when there were more urgent matters in front of her, but it had been there all morning, sitting at the edge of her attention with the particular quality of something that needed to be looked at properly before she could consider the morning's business genuinely finished. Dorothy Pratt had taken the receipt and used it as a tool of suggestion, an insinuation about Martin and about rat poison and about the death of his wife, and she had done this knowing, she said, that there were no real questions about Helen's death. She had done it knowing it was false. But knowing a thing and being certain of it were, Miss Marple had long since learned, not always the same. Dorothy had been devoted to Helen Crane. If she had believed, even for a moment, that there were genuine questions about how Helen had died, she would not have used those questions as a blunt instrument to frighten Winifred Eyre. She would have gone to the police, or to Dr. Haydock, or she would have done something rather more serious than arrive at a cottage at 6:10 in the morning with a receipt in her pocket. No, Dorothy had not believed it. But Miss Marple had spent the morning with a question she had not yet put to anyone who could answer it, which was whether there was anything about Helen Crane's death that warranted the looking, independent of Dorothy's tactical use of it. She went to see Dr. Haydock again. He was in his surgery at noon, between the morning's consultations and the afternoons, eating a sandwich at his desk with the focused efficiency of a man who was accustomed to meals as fuel rather than occasions. And he looked up when Miss Marple came in with the expression of someone who had expected her, and was glad she had appeared before, rather than after the sandwich was done. "Helen Crane," she said, sitting in the patient's chair across from him. Haydock set down his sandwich. "I thought we'd get there," he said. "Tell me about her illness," Miss Marple said. He was quiet for a moment in the way of a doctor ordering his recollections. "October to February," he said. "Gradual onset. Nausea, abdominal pain, weight loss, fatigue. Classic presentation of a severe gastroenteritis, the chronic type, which in my experience affects people who work outdoors and have soil contact, as I told you this morning." "But," Miss Marple said. "I didn't say but," Haydock said. "You set down your sandwich," Miss Marple said, "which in my observation means you are preparing to say something you have been thinking about and have not yet said to anyone." He looked at her with the expression she had known for 40 years, the expression of a man who found her somewhere between invaluable and deeply inconvenient, and which she had always found rather endearing. "When Winifred Eyre was found this morning," he said carefully, "and I began thinking about the case, as I always do, the question of what led to it and who was involved, I found myself thinking about Martin Crane, and through Martin Crane about Helen Crane, and about the autumn and winter of 1950 to 1951. He paused. "There is nothing in my notes that I would present as evidence of anything. Her symptoms were consistent with what I diagnosed. But, Miss Marple said. "Arsenic poisoning," he said. "In its chronic form, presents with nausea, abdominal pain, weight loss, and fatigue. In a person who works with soil and animals, and who has regular contact with various agricultural compounds, distinguishing the two without a specific test would be—" He paused. "Difficult. I did not do a specific test because I had no reason to. I treated what I saw." Miss Marple looked at the window of the surgery, through which the high street was visible, the January village going about its Tuesday business in the cold. "Arsenic," she said. "Is it present in rat poison?" "Some formulations," Haydock said. "Not all. The product from Enderby's hardware that Martin Crane purchased on Monday is a phosphide-based product, not arsenic." He paused. "But there are older formulations. Ones that have been on the shelves of agricultural supply merchants for decades. Ones that a market garden would have had in its stores without anyone thinking much about it." "Would a post-mortem on Helen Crane be possible now?" Miss Marple asked. "After 18 months. Haydock looked at her steadily. "Arsenic persists in hair and bone," he said. "If there were grounds to exhume, the evidence would still be there." "Grounds," Miss Marple said. "What would constitute grounds?" "Reasonable cause to believe the death was not natural," he said, "from a medical or forensic perspective, or information from a credible source that raised specific questions." He paused. "Or the judgment of a senior police officer that such an examination was warranted." "Inspector Slack," Miss Marple said. "He is in the tone of someone identifying a tool that was blunt but functional." "Inspector Slack," Haydock agreed, "who is currently at the police station with Dorothy Pratt, and who has, I imagine, rather a full morning. But who will also, when he is finished with Dorothy, need to determine whether the events of this morning exist in isolation, or within a larger pattern." Miss Marple folded her hands in her lap and thought about Martin Crane's complicated grief at his wife's graveside, the kind of grief that had at its heart not simplicity but its opposite, and about the market garden kitchen with its old Aga, and about a receipt taken from a coat pocket by a woman who had intended to use it as a weapon, and had instead used it as an accidental indicator of something she had not known was there. Dorothy did not know, Miss Marple said. when she took the receipt. She was inventing questions about Helen's death. She did not know there might be real ones. No, Haydock said. I don't think she did. But she planted the question, Miss Marple said slowly. In my mind, at least, if not in Winifred's. Because Winifred was calm, she wasn't frightened by it. She dealt with it. But I was not calm about it, and I am still not. She stood up from the patient's chair and looked at Haydock. Winifred Eyre died of her heart, she said, in cold and stress, on her own path, in her nightclothes. That much is settled. But if Helen Crane did not die of gastroenteritis, then we have a rather different kind of mourning on our hands. Yes, Haydock said, we do. And the only way to know is to ask the question properly. Yes, he said again. Miss Marple buttoned her coat. Then I think, she said, that you and I need to go back to the police station, James, before Inspector Slack sends Dorothy home and considers his morning's work complete. She paused at the door. Bring your notes on Helen Crane, the specific dates, and the symptom progression. He will want the medical detail rather than my impressions, and he ought to have both. Haydock looked at her for a moment, and then he opened his desk drawer and took out a folder. I thought I might need these today, he said. Yes, Miss Marple said. I thought you might have thought that. They walked to the police station together, the doctor and the elderly spinster, along the January High Street in the thin, cold noon light, and the village observed them going with the mild curiosity of a place that had long since understood that when these two walked somewhere together with purpose, it was worth noting. Miss Marple was thinking about Martin Crane. She was thinking about the quality of his grief, and about the farmhouse kitchen, and about the way he had said Winifred's name on the telephone call at 9 the previous evening, ordinary and warm, the way a man said the name of someone he had become accustomed to and was glad of. She was thinking about the possibility that she was wrong. She had been wrong before, not often, and not in the direction of suspecting innocence where there was guilt, but occasionally in the direction of suspecting complexity, where there was only the plain sad fact of a man who had lost his wife to an illness and was trying, just 18 months later, to find his way back to something. She thought about the complicated grief at the graveside. She thought about what complicated grief meant when it was a man burying a wife he might have poisoned. She thought about what it meant when it was a man burying a wife he had loved imperfectly, as people loved each other, and who was grieving both the loss and the imperfection simultaneously. Both were possible. That was the difficulty. Both were entirely possible, and she would not know which was true until Inspector Slack, with a degree of persuasion from Haydock's notes and her own observations, asked the question that needed asking. She walked beside Dr. Haydock through the cold and did not say what she was thinking, because there was nothing useful to say until they arrived, and she had long since stopped saying things that were not yet useful. The police station door was a dark green paint, the municipal green of official buildings, and she pushed it open and went inside. Chapter 8. The Colour of Old Evidence. Inspector Slack was not pleased to see them. He was not precisely displeased either, which was the most one could hope for from Inspector Slack in the middle of a complicated morning, and he received them in the small room off the main office that served as something between an interview room and a place where things that did not have a home elsewhere were put, with its smell of old paper and its single radiator that produced heat in the theoretical rather than the practical sense. Dorothy Pratt had been sent home an hour earlier with the instruction not to leave the village, which was the form these things took when a decision had not yet been made about what to charge a person with, or indeed whether to charge them with anything. 1. The legal position of a woman who had left another woman lying on a path being, as Inspector Slack's sergeant had observed in a low voice to nobody in particular, not entirely straightforward. Miss Marple sat in the chair that Dorothy Pratt had recently vacated and folded her hands and waited for Inspector Slack to finish reading the single sheet of paper he was holding, which he had picked up from the table in the deliberate manner of someone demonstrating that they were occupied. Haydock set his folder on the table. "Well," said Inspector Slack, setting down his paper with the resigned expression of a man who has decided to make the best of something. "I take it this isn't a social call." "We have some information," Haydock said. "That is relevant to the events of this morning and possibly to a prior matter." "Prior matter," Inspector Slack said. "Helen Crane," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Inspector Slack looked at her with the expression he reserved for Miss Marple, the one she had always privately thought of as the expression of a man who had sat on something unexpected and was determined to give no indication of this. "Helen Crane," he said, "died in February of last year of a gastric illness. Dr. Haydock signed the certificate. Yes, said Haydock. I did. At the time, I had no reason to do otherwise. This morning I find myself with a reason to reconsider. He opened the folder and laid out several sheets in order, the methodical arrangement of a man presenting a case rather than an opinion. The symptom progression, he said, is consistent with chronic arsenic poisoning. I do not say it is inconsistent with gastroenteritis because it is not, but it is consistent with both, and given the circumstances that have emerged this morning, I think the question warrants formal examination. Inspector Slack looked at the sheets. He was a faster reader than he appeared, Miss Marple had always thought, one of several qualities he concealed beneath his general manner. The circumstances that emerged this morning, he said, meaning the receipt. The receipt is one element, Miss Marple said. In itself it means nothing. Martin Crane had a legitimate reason to purchase rat poison, and the product he purchased is not arsenic-based. But it brought to my attention the question of what other products a market garden of that size might have held, and for how long, and what a person with access to that garden might have had available to them over an extended period. Inspector Slack looked at her. You're suggesting Martin Crane poisoned his wife. I am suggesting, Miss Marple said carefully, that Helen Crane's death presents some features that warrant examination, and that the examination is straightforward and definitive, which is a relatively rare quality in these matters. Either the examination will produce evidence of arsenic or it will not. If it does not, the matter is settled. If it does, the matter is settled differently. Slack looked at Haydock. Exhumation. Yes, Haydock said. A pause, in which Inspector Slack performed the internal calculation that Miss Marple recognised as the calculation between the cost of being wrong about doing something and the cost of being wrong about not doing it, and which she had, over many years of watching him perform it, found he generally got right in the end when given sufficient evidence and sufficient time. The market garden, Slack said, is stores, if there was arsenic there. The agricultural supply merchants in Melchester keep records, Miss Marple said, going back a considerable number of years. If arsenic-based compounds were purchased on Martin Crane's account, there will be a record. Slack looked at her. How do you know what agricultural supply merchants keep? I have a garden, Miss Marple said mildly. One takes an interest. He sent his sergeant to the agricultural supply merchant in Melchester at 2 o'clock. The sergeant returned at 3:30 with a ledger, or rather with a transcription from a ledger, 3 pages of it, the account of Crane's market garden going back 8 years in neat columns of dates and products and quantities. The sergeant had copied the relevant entries by hand with the careful penmanship of a young man who had been told this was important and had believed it. There were 2 purchases of sodium arsenate, an older formulation of rat and pest control, on the Crane account. The first in March of 1948, the second in September of 1950, September 1950. 6 weeks before Helen Crane began to feel unwell. Miss Marple sat with Dr. Haydock in the small room while Inspector Slack read the transcription, and she watched his face, which was doing the particular work of a man who's been handed something he did not expect, and is deciding what it changes. The first purchase, Haydock said, March 1948. That's a legitimate purchase for a market garden. Arsenic compounds were common pest control before the phosphide formulations became standard. Nobody would look twice at it. But a second purchase, Miss Marple said quietly, in September 1950, by which time most market gardens had moved to the newer formulations, which are more effective. A second purchase of an older compound 2 years after the first, 6 weeks before his wife began declining. Inspector Slack set the transcription down. The first purchase, he said, March 1948. How much was used? Is there any way to know how much of the original purchase remained by September 1950? No record of usage, Haydock said. But a quantity sufficient for a market garden's needs in 1948, used at normal rates, would not be exhausted in 2 years. A second purchase would be excessive. Unless, Inspector Slack said, he was supplementing what he had, topping up. Yes, Haydock said. That is one way to read it. Or unless, Miss Marple said, the first purchase was used for its intended purpose, and the second was purchased with a different purpose in mind, in which case the September 1950 purchase tells us something about when the decision was made. The room was very quiet. The radiator ticked. Outside, the January afternoon had given up the pretense of light and was settling into the early dark of winter. He was seeing someone, Inspector Slack said, after his wife died, the airwoman. He began walking out with Miss Eyre in the spring of last year, Miss Marple said, some 4 months after Helen's death, which is, on the face of it, somewhat swift, but grief takes its own course and there is no fixed proper interval. Unless, Slack said, he already knew who he was going to see afterward. Miss Marple looked at the window and the darkness beyond it. There is one more thing, she said. I spoke with Martin Crane this morning at the farm. He mentioned that Winifred Eyre came by the farmhouse yesterday evening at about 6 o'clock to return a book. She was there for 20 or 30 minutes. His coat, the one he wore to Melchester on Monday, was on the hook by the back door. Dorothy took the receipt from that coat during her visit on Monday afternoon. But Winifred was also in that kitchen yesterday evening. Inspector Slack looked at her sharply. You're saying the Eyre woman might have taken the receipt? I'm saying, Miss Marple said carefully, that when I suggested to Martin Crane that he check his coat pocket and he found the receipt missing, his immediate response was to mention Dorothy's visit. He did not mention Winifred's. She paused. Which may mean he had forgotten it, or it may mean he chose not to remember it in that moment. Haydock looked at her. You think Winifred found it herself, yesterday evening? I think it is possible, Miss Marple said, that Winifred found the receipt in his coat pocket while she was in the kitchen, and that she took it, not because she thought it meant anything terrible, but because she recognized it as something connected to him and wanted to ask him about it. And that when Dorothy arrived at 6 in the morning with her insinuations about Helen, Winifred had the receipt already and produced it from her pocket at some point during that conversation. She produced it, Slack said, and Dorothy saw it and thought Winifred had already found it and was more suspicious than she was pretending to be. Which would explain, Miss Marple said quietly, why Dorothy's account of the conversation described Winifred as calm. Because Winifred was calm. She had the receipt and she was not frightened by it. But Dorothy, seeing it in Winifred's hand, became frightened. Because to Dorothy it looked as though Winifred knew something. The room absorbed this. Whether Winifred knew anything or not, Haydock said slowly, is now a question that cannot be answered. She cannot tell us. No, Miss Marple said, she cannot. Inspector Slack stood up and put the transcription in his breast pocket, and picked up his hat from the table and put it on with the particular decisiveness of a man who has made up his mind about something. I'll need a formal application for exhumation, he said to Haydock, and I'll be wanting another conversation with Martin Crane this afternoon. He looked at Miss Marple. You'll be at home this evening, Miss Marple. It was not a question, but it was not quite an instruction either. It was the form of words Inspector Slack used when he wanted to know where she was without appearing to want to know. I expect so, she said. She and Haydock walked back out into the January afternoon. The dark already fully settled now, the high street lit by its 2 lamp-posts and the yellow oblongs of lit shop windows, and the cold had the particular quality of January evening cold, which was colder than the cold of morning in the way that cold things became colder when the day stopped trying. Do you think it was him? Haydock asked when they were out of earshot of the station. Miss Marple walked 3 steps before answering, which was the interval she needed. I think, she said carefully, that the evidence points in a direction and that the direction will be clarified by the examination. I think the coincidence of the September purchase is the kind of coincidence that a court will find uncomfortable. She paused. And I also think that I spoke with Martin Crane this morning and he appeared to be a man in genuine grief about Winifred Eyre. And that genuine grief, in a man who may have disposed of one inconvenient person, is a complicated thing to account for. Perhaps he had grown fond of her, Haydock said. Perhaps, Miss Marple said. Or perhaps he's a man capable of genuine feeling toward the person he has at present, and a compartmentalized attitude toward the person who was in the way. Both are human possibilities. Neither is comfortable. They parted at the surgery door, and Miss Marple walked the remaining 5 minutes to her own house in the dark, past the frozen pond and the bare chestnut and the lamplight on the high street, and she let herself in and put the kettle on and sat at the kitchen table while it boiled. And she was very still in the way she was still when a thing had reached the point where her part in it was largely done, and other people's was largely beginning. The house was warm. Outside, the frost was forming again on the garden, patient and inevitable, the cold doing its ordinary work. Chapter 9. The Grain Store and the Ledger. Martin Crane was brought to the police station at 5 o'clock that afternoon. He was not arrested. He was, in the careful language Inspector Slack used when telephoning the farm, invited to assist with inquiries relating to the morning's events. which was the form of words that meant something considerably more specific than it appeared, and which Martin Crane, who was not a naive man, would have understood in its proper weight. Miss Marple was not present for this conversation. She was at home, as she had told Inspector Slack she would be, sitting by the sitting-room fire with her knitting, the red mittens now finished and wrapped in tissue paper on the table beside her, replaced by the beginning of a pair of socks in grey wool that required the kind of attention that kept her hands occupied without occupying the part of her mind that was still turning over the morning. She was thinking about the grain store. Specifically, she was thinking about what Haydock had said, about the first purchase of sodium arsenate in March 1948, and about normal usage rates, and about whether a market garden's legitimate pest control needs would or would not have exhausted a standard purchase in 2 years. She did not know the answer to this with any precision, because her knowledge of market garden operations, while broader than Inspector Slack had implied, did not extend to the specific consumption rates of sodium arsenate on 4 acres of growing land, but she knew someone who did. She put down her knitting at 5:30 and telephoned Colonel Bantry, who had been a keen kitchen gardener before his health made it impractical, and who retained the knowledge of a man who had spent 20 years consulting with nurserymen and agricultural merchants about the practicalities of growing things at scale. Colonel Bantry, who was used to telephone calls from Miss Marple on subjects that turned out not to be what they initially appeared to be, received her question about sodium arsenate usage rates with the equanimity of long acquaintance, and thought about it for a moment before answering. "Depends on the application," he said. "If you're talking about soil treatment as a broad pesticide, you'd go through a fair quantity in a season, but if you're talking about it for rats specifically, which is what it used to be used for before the newer stuff, you'd use very little. Set it in bait stations, covered, so the birds and dogs don't get at it. A small quantity goes a long way." He paused. "Why?" "I'm trying to understand whether a purchase in 1948 would plausibly have been exhausted by 1950, Miss Marple said. "For rat control specifically, on 4 acres? No," Colonel Bantry said. "Not if it was being used properly. You'd have plenty left." "Thank you, Colonel," Miss Marple said. "You have been very helpful." "Have I?" he said, in the tone of a man who suspected he had been helpful in a direction he hadn't anticipated, which was also the tone of a long acquaintance. Miss Marple thanked him again and put down the telephone and stood for a moment in the hallway. The first purchase had not been exhausted. There was sodium arsenate remaining from the 1948 purchase when Martin Crane went to the agricultural merchant in September 1950 and bought more. He had not needed more for his grain store. He had needed more for something else, and he had needed it in a quantity that would not be conspicuous if he bought it on a trade account at a time when such purchases were still routine. He had been careful. He had been patient. He had bought it 6 weeks before Helen began to feel unwell, which gave him time to begin in a way that would look like a slow, onset illness rather than a sudden one. She went back to her sitting room and picked up her knitting, and thought about the particular kind of patience that was required to do what she suspected Martin Crane had done. The patience of a man who had decided and had then waited, and had administered a thing in small amounts over a long period, and had watched his wife decline and had been at her bedside and had maintained the marriage and the household and the appearances of a devoted husband, and had then, when it was over, grieved at the graveside with the complicated grief of a man who was feeling both loss and relief and guilt simultaneously, which was the mixture that produced exactly the quality she had seen in his face that February morning. She had seen it, and she had noted it, and she had not understood it then. She understood it now. Dr. Haydock telephoned at 7 o'clock. "The grain store," he said. "Sergeant Lake went out this afternoon, while Slack had Martin at the station. He found sodium arsenate in the original 1948 tin, a substantial amount remaining. More than consistent with 8 years of legitimate rat control, in the opinion of the agricultural consultant they brought in from Melchester." "And the 1950 purchase," Miss Marple said. "No trace of it," Haydock said. "The tin is not in the store, it is not in any of the farm buildings, it has not been disposed of through the agricultural merchant, who would have record of a return. It appears to have been used entirely." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. The 1950 purchase, bought 6 weeks before Helen began to feel unwell, entirely used by the time Helen died in February 1951. The 1948 purchase, legitimate, sitting in the grain store with a substantial amount remaining, never used for the purpose Martin Crane gave as his reason for buying the second tin. "The exhumation," she said. "Slack has the order," Haydock said. Tomorrow morning. I'll be present with a pathologist from Melchester." He paused. "Jane, the conversation with Martin this evening. Slack said he was cooperative, explained the rat poison purchase, gave a consistent account, nothing that contradicted the facts." "He is not a man who contradicts facts," Miss Marple said. "He uses facts. He used the fact of the grain store problem to explain the Monday purchase, and the Monday purchase was perfectly legitimate." She paused. "The question was never the Monday purchase." "No," Haydock said. "The question was always 1950. And when Slack asked about the 1950 purchase, he said he couldn't precisely recall buying it. Said he bought various things from various merchants over the years and his records from that period weren't complete." A pause. "He didn't deny it." "No," Miss Marple said. "He wouldn't deny something that was in a ledger. He's too careful for that." She was quiet for a moment. He knew what the ledger showed. He was at the merchant this morning buying the Monday purchase, and he would have seen the account book as he always did. He would have known the 1950 entry was there. "And he said nothing about it," Haydock said, "when you spoke with him this morning." "He said nothing about it," Miss Marple agreed. "He spoke about the Monday purchase and the grain store problem, and he was entirely consistent and cooperative, and he did not mention 1950, because there was nothing he could say about 1950 that would help him." She looked at her knitting, the grey sock taking shape on the needles, the stitches moving slowly forward. "He's a man who knows what not to say." "That is its own kind of information." Haydock said good night, and Miss Marple put down the telephone and went back to her chair and her knitting and the fire, which had burned down to the deep red stage that needed a log but did not immediately require one. She was thinking about Winifred Eyre. She was thinking about a woman who had been calm and kind and clear with Dorothy Pratt at 6 a.m, who had managed a difficult visitor with composure and said what needed to be said and gone to the gate to latch it behind her, and who had died on the path of a heart condition she had not known she had, in circumstances arranged by no one but precipitated by Dorothy's arrival. Winifred had not known about 1950. She had found the receipt for the Monday purchase in Martin's coat pocket and had taken it, not with suspicion, but with the ordinary curiosity of a woman who was close to a man and found a document in his pocket and thought she would ask about it. She had not had time to ask. She had managed everything perfectly, right up to the moment her heart gave out in the cold, and she had never known that the man she was walking out with had, in all probability, poisoned his wife. There was a particular sadness to this that Miss Marple sat with for a while, without trying to resolve it, because some things did not resolve and it was not useful to pretend they did. She added a log to the fire and went back to her knitting. The grey sock grew, stitch by stitch, in the firelight. Outside, St. Mary Mead lay in its January dark, and somewhere across the village a man was sitting in a farmhouse kitchen with a cold aga, and the knowledge that the morning had turned in a direction he had not anticipated, and Miss Marple hoped, without sentimentality, that he had the capacity to feel the weight of what was coming. She thought he probably did. That was, in its way, the worst part of it. The arrest came at 9 o'clock the following morning, after the exhumation team had been at the churchyard for 2 hours, and it came in the particular bureaucratic form of these things, not dramatic but persistent, the slow machinery of consequence grinding into motion. The pathologist from Melchester found what Haydock had feared he would find, which was the residue of arsenic in Helen Crane's hair and bone, elevated levels. Levels inconsistent with ordinary environmental exposure and consistent with sustained ingestion over a period of months. Miss Marple heard this from Haydock at 10:30 on the telephone, and she received it with the stillness she always received confirmed conclusions, neither satisfaction nor the opposite, simply the acknowledgement of a thing that had now been established beyond the useful ambiguity she had tried to maintain while there was still reason to. "Martin Crane," she said. "Yes," said Haydock. "Slack went to the farm at 9. He was there. He didn't run." "No," Miss Marple said. "He wouldn't run. Running is for people who have not spent 2 years being careful." She thanked Haydock and put down the telephone and sat for a moment in her sitting room with her hands in her lap and the knitting bag beside her. She was thinking about a receipt for rat poison, purchased on a Monday for a legitimate purpose, taken from a coat pocket by a woman trying to frighten someone away from her brother, finding its way into the hand of a dead woman on a frost-covered path at 6:20 on a January morning, and bringing with it, entirely inadvertently, the unravelling of a thing that had been carefully buried for 2 years. The receipt had not been meant to reveal anything real. It had been Dorothy's blunt instrument, her fabricated insinuation, and it had been Winifred's ordinary curiosity, a document found in a coat pocket and pocketed for later inquiry. Neither woman had understood what they were handling. Both had handled it in the way of their characters, Dorothy with strategic intent and Winifred with calm practicality, bossas. And the receipt had done what it had done regardless of either of their intentions, which was to draw attention to a question that had needed to be asked for 2 years. This was, Miss Marple thought, the thing about evidence. It did not always mean what the person who found it thought it meant, or what the person who created it intended. It simply was. It waited to be understood correctly, and sometimes the person who found it was not the person who understood it, and sometimes understanding came in a direction that nobody had predicted. She picked up her knitting. The grey sock needed 3 more inches before the heel. Chapter 10. The Ordinary Things. The trial of Martin Crane opened in Melchester Crown Court in the 2nd week of April, when the winter had finally relinquished St. Mary Mead with the reluctant gradualness of a season that had overstayed its welcome, and the village was doing what English villages did in April, which was conducting the cautious provisional business of coming back to life, the bulbs up, the hedges greening, the afternoons fractionally longer each day in the way that accumulated imperceptibly, until one evening you looked up and noticed that it was still light at 6 o'clock, and felt the particular quiet pleasure of that. Miss Marple followed the trial in the Melchester Gazette, which she received each morning alongside her post, and she read the daily accounts with the attention she brought to things she had been part of without being central to, which was a distinction she kept carefully, because she was not a person who required centrality, and because she had learned that the people who required it generally produced worse results than those who did not. The pathologist's evidence was presented on the 3rd day, and received by the jury with the concentrated attention of people who had not previously considered that arsenic persisted in hair and bone, and who found this fact, once presented, both interesting and deeply uncomfortable. The agricultural merchant's ledger was produced on the 4th day, the 1950 entry read aloud, the 1948 entry read alongside it for comparison, Colonel Bantry's opinion on usage rates, conveyed through an agricultural expert, entered into the record. Martin Crane's solicitor argued that the 1950 purchase was legitimate, that the absence of the tin was consistent with normal disposal of used containers, that the arsenic in Helen's remains was within ranges attributable to occupational exposure in a woman who spent her working life on farming land. The jury did not agree. The verdict came on the 9th day, guilty of murder, and the sentence was pronounced on the 10th, and Miss Marple read both in the Gazette at her kitchen table on a Thursday morning in April with her first cup of tea, and then she set the paper aside and looked out at the garden, where Cherry Baker was hanging washing on the line in the thin April sunshine with the cheerful efficiency she brought to everything, and the first of the tulips were showing colour in the border, red and yellow, and the apple tree was in early blossom, white against the April blue. She sat with it for a while, the verdict and what it meant and what it did not mean, the limits of what justice could do and the necessity of it anyway. Dorothy Pratt had been charged with wilful neglect, failing to render assistance to a person in need. The charge was not the most serious available, and was not the least serious, which reflected the genuine legal ambiguity of a situation in which a woman had left another woman on a path and the woman had died, and the causal connection between the leaving and the dying was real but not direct. The cold and the undiagnosed heart condition inserting themselves into the chain between Dorothy's choice and Winifred's death. She had pleaded guilty, which her solicitor had advised, and which Dorothy had agreed to without. Miss Marple thought, any particular resistance, because Dorothy Pratt was not a woman who avoided accountability when she had finally understood that accountability was required of her. She had received a suspended sentence and a fine, and had returned to her stone house on the far side of the village, where she lived as she had always lived, quietly and with competence, and she was observed to visit the churchyard on Tuesdays, which was not the day she had previously visited, suggesting the change was intentional. Miss Marple did not go to see her. She thought Dorothy did not need visiting, and she thought that her own presence at Dorothy's door would carry a weight that neither of them would find useful. She noted instead that Dorothy had begun attending the 8 o'clock communion on Sundays, which she had not previously done, and that she sat in the back pew on the right, and that she didn't linger after the service, and that she was always gone before Miss Marple reached the door. This seemed to Miss Marple like a reasonable arrangement, and she did not alter it. Arthur Croft continued his round, He came down the lane on Tuesday and Thursday and Saturday at 7:15, the float whirring in the quiet of the early morning, and Miss Marple watched him from her sitting-room window, and he set her pints on the step, and on the Saturdays when she happened to be at the gate he nodded and said good morning, and she nodded back and said the same. He was not a man who discussed things once they were over, which was a quality she respected. He had been, she thought, quite remarkably composed throughout. He had found something terrible on a January morning, and he had managed it correctly, and he had continued his round. And when the investigation had proceeded and the trial had come and gone, he had gone on getting up in the dark and loading the float and driving the route that took him past Jasmine Cottage and Cornaway's Lane, and all the other ordinary fixtures of a village morning, because the route did not change because something had happened on it, and the milk did not stop because the morning had been interrupted. There was something in this that Miss Marple found, not consoling exactly, but steadying. In May she walked to Jasmine Cottage. The cottage had been empty since January, Winifred having no close family to claim it, and it had passed through the solicitor's office and would eventually be sold. But for now it stood in its lane in the May sunshine with the blue door and the window boxes, and someone had planted the snowdrops, Winifred's snowdrops, the bulbs that had been under the lip of the box since December, and they had come and gone already in the January and February ground, white and small and precisely what they were supposed to be, and now in May the boxes held something else. Pansies from the look of it, purple and yellow, the kind that a neighbour put in when they couldn't bear to leave a box empty. Miss Marple stood at the gate for a moment and looked at the cottage, and she thought about Winifred Eyre, who had been a schoolmistress, and who had grown dahlias, and who had been calm under pressure, and who had liked the walk and the reason for it. She thought about the morning in January when she had been brought out of herself by something she had managed with composure, and she thought about the fact that Winifred had never known the full extent of what was happening around her, which was either a mercy or an injustice and was perhaps both simultaneously. She thought about the receipt in the left hand, which had not meant what Dorothy had intended it to mean, and had meant something quite different, and which Winifred had held without understanding its significance, in the grip that remained even after everything else had stopped. Then she latched the gate behind her, and walked back down Cornaway's Lane toward the village, at her usual deliberate pace in the May sunshine. She had one more thing to do, and she did it that afternoon. She went to see Mrs. Dodd at the third cottage, who had heard the motor car in the dark and had looked through her bedroom curtain and gone back to bed, and she brought her a pot of her own lemon curd, which Mrs. Dodd received with genuine pleasure, and they had tea, and Miss Marple thanked her for what she had told her in January because it had been important, the cold engine on the lane, the timing of the car. "Did I help?" Mrs. Dodd asked, with the straightforward curiosity of someone who wanted to know what their part in a thing had amounted to. "You helped a great deal," Miss Marple said honestly. "The cold engine told me the car had been there a while. If it had been warm, the person inside might have arrived only moments before Mr. Croft. But it was cold, which meant they had been there long enough for the engine to cool, which meant they had been inside with Winifred for some time, which meant the conversation had been a real one rather than a brief encounter." Mrs. Dodd looked interested. And that mattered? It mattered because it meant Winifred had had sufficient time to deal with whatever she was presented with, Miss Marple said. And she had dealt with it. She had been calm. She was managing things. She paused. It was the cold, in the end, that she could not manage. The cold and a heart condition she didn't know she had. Not the conversation. Mrs. Dodd was quiet for a moment. So it wasn't anything that could have been prevented, really. The conversation, I mean. Dorothy going there. Dorothy going there, Miss Marple said carefully, was a choice that had consequences that Dorothy could not have predicted. That is not the same as saying it made no difference. It made a difference, but the difference it made was not the one Dorothy intended, which is perhaps its own form of justice. She drank her tea and admired Mrs. Dodd's kitchen, which had a good aspect for the afternoon light and was very cheerful in May, and she talked about the summer ahead and the garden plans and the village fete, which was in July and which required discussion of the cake competition, which was always contentious in the way that cake competitions in villages were always contentious, a combination of genuine baking pride and old grievances that made for a reliable annual drama. And Mrs. Dodd laughed about the cake competition, and Miss Marple laughed too, and the May afternoon lay warmly across the kitchen table between them. And outside Cornaway's Lane was quiet and ordinary in the sunshine. She walked home at 5 o'clock the long way, through the high street and past the pond, which was itself again in May, the ducks back, the willows reflected, the children from the school walking along its edge on their way home. She stopped for a moment at the post office to collect something she had ordered, a new pattern book for socks, because she had found the grey sock pattern somewhat limited, and she had 3 more pairs to make before Christmas, and she liked to have variety. The woman at the post office counter handed it over and said, "Wasn't it dreadful what had happened back in January, about the milkman finding Miss Eyre, and wasn't it something, the way things turned out?" She said it in the way of someone who had processed a thing through the village conversation enough times that it had acquired the quality of a story, a comprehensible narrative with a shape to it, beginning and middle and end. "Yes," said Miss Marple pleasantly. "It was quite something." She put the pattern book in her bag and went out into the May afternoon, and walked the last 5 minutes home, past the horse-chestnut on the green, which had its candles up now, the upright flower clusters white and pink, the tree entirely recovered from January, and showing no interest whatsoever in what had passed beneath it. She let herself in and put the kettle on, and sat at the kitchen table with the pattern book and looked at the options for the next pair of socks, which were numerous and some of which were quite adventurous for socks. And she settled on one with a small cable detail at the ankle, which would be satisfying to work and would not be immediately visible when worn, which was the nature of that kind of effort. Good work done without display. She thought that was, on the whole, the kind she preferred. Cherry came in at 5:30 and said there was a letter and would there be supper, and Miss Marple said there would, and looked at the letter, which was from her great-niece Rowena, thanking her for the yellow cardigan, which had arrived and was lovely and fitted perfectly, and was just the thing for the spring evenings in Scotland, which were still cold. Miss Marple set the letter on the table and was glad about the cardigan, which had taken longer than expected because of the dropped stitch, but which had been worth the time and was now doing its work up in Scotland, warm and pale yellow in the spring evenings, exactly what it was supposed to be. She put the kettle on for a second time and opened the pattern book to the cable ankle sock and picked up her needles. St. Mary Mead went about its evening business around her, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary village in an ordinary May, and outside the kitchen window the garden was green, and the apple blossom was gone now, the petals long since on the ground, and in their place the first small hard green beginnings of apples, patient and certain, doing the slow work of becoming what they were going to be. Thank you for spending this evening with us, dear friends. We do hope you found a warm corner to settle into, and that January felt a little further away by the end of it. And do let us know in the comments where you were listening from tonight, and whether the cold engine gave you the answer before Chapter 8. We shall have another mystery for you very soon. Until then, keep something warm to hand, and do pay attention to the small things. Miss Marple always does.